Gaius Julius Caesar stood at a critical crossroads. His ambitious campaign to subjugate the peoples of Gaul was drawing to a close, even as his relationship with his rival Pompey and the Roman Senate rapidly deteriorated. With the end of his governorship approaching, Caesar faced the very real possibility that his enemies would strip him of both his military command and the wealth he had amassed through conquest. Against this backdrop of mounting political tension, Caesar composed a series of commentaries detailing his military campaigns in Gaul. These writings were intended to bypass the Senate and appeal directly to the Roman public, securing popular support for his actions. During the drafting process, Caesar chose to include a survey of the customs and social structures of the conquered regions. Within this account, he offered a description of a particular religious class that would become central to later perceptions of Celtic society. Rather than referring to them simply as priests as he had in earlier passages, Caesar used the Gaulish term Druid or Druidae. This designation was also employed by authors both before and after him, but it was Caesar's portrayal that would endure long after the group itself had disappeared. According to his account, the Druids constituted the highest and most influential class within Gaulish society, possessing authority over both religious and civil matters. Caesar wrote that they instructed their followers in the immortality of the soul, encouraged reverence for the gods, promoted moral conduct, and emphasized the importance of courage. He also attributed to them extensive knowledge of cosmology and the natural world. Central to their religious role, he claimed, was the performance of sacrifices to the gods, rituals that allegedly included the construction of large wooden effigies, in which both animals and humans were confined and burned alive. Both Caesar and later Roman writers asserted that such practices were eventually suppressed by Roman rule. Nevertheless, Druidic traditions are believed to have survived beyond the continent, particularly in Britain and Ireland, where they persisted for several centuries before gradually yielding to the spread of Christianity. Even after their disappearance, the memory of the Druids endured. Modern revivalist movements claim that elements of their ancient teachings continue today, preserved in Celtic folklore and contemporary neo-Druidic traditions. In recent decades, scholars have subjected both classical texts and archaeological evidence to renewed scrutiny in an effort to construct a more accurate picture of these enigmatic figures. Despite this growing body of research, a fundamental question remains unresolved. Who were the Druids, really? For the past 5 centuries, the Druids have captured the imagination of scholars and the public alike in France, Britain, and Ireland. During this time, they have been portrayed in countless ways. The earliest modern depictions emerged in the 16th century, as Western Europe rediscovered the literary heritage of ancient Greece and Rome, and sought to reinterpret its own distant past. In early modern accounts, the Druids were often portrayed as revered ancestral figures, evidence of a sophisticated pre-Roman culture among the peoples of Western Europe. Over time, however, this favorable interpretation shifted. Less sympathetic writers recast them as symbols of pre-Christian barbarism, portraying them as idol worshippers engaged in ritual violence and human sacrifice. By the 18th century, fascination with the Druids had intensified into something close to an obsession, and their image became increasingly shaped by romantic imagination rather than historical evidence. Within this romantic framework, Druids were reimagined as noble yet primitive philosophers, guardians of ancient wisdom living in harmony with nature. This idealized portrayal was further complicated by what archaeologist Stuart Piggott famously described as irrational mysticism. The emerging discipline of archaeology unintentionally deepened this confusion, as artifacts from vastly different periods were mistakenly grouped together and attributed to the Druids, reinforcing a distorted and ahistorical composite image. This misrepresentation was amplified by the persistent association of the Druids with monumental prehistoric sites across Britain and France. Structures such as Stonehenge became firmly embedded in popular imagination as Druidic centers, despite the absence of credible evidence linking them to Iron Age religious elites. Although modern scholarship has long challenged these claims, the association continues to resonate in public consciousness. These romanticized notions endured well into the modern era. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that advances in archaeological dating firmly dismantled the traditional Druid stereotype. We now understand that monuments like Stonehenge predate the earliest possible emergence of Druids by several millennia, and that there remains no definitive archaeological proof confirming the Druids as a distinct, identifiable institution. Nevertheless, the cultural legacy of the Druids remains powerful. Each year, thousands of self-identified Druids and spiritual practitioners gather at ancient monuments to mark seasonal festivals and celebrate the natural world. Contemporary neo-Druidic movements continue to grow throughout Europe and North America, often asserting continuity with an ancient tradition, claims that remain deeply contested. This enduring fascination brings us back to the central questions. Who were the Druids? Did they truly exist in Britain and Gaul, and if so, how closely do they resemble the figures described by classical authors such as Julius Caesar? What were their beliefs, and can any trace of those beliefs be detected in modern Druidic practice? To approach these questions, we must rely on four principal bodies of evidence, each presenting its own limitations. The first consists of accounts written by classical authors, spanning from the 8th century BC to the late 4th century AD. The second is the archaeological record of Iron Age Britain and Gaul, which offers indirect insight into indigenous religious practices. Third are the Irish mythological cycles, which depict a pre-Christian Ireland where Druids appear as prominent figures, magicians, judges, and advisors to the pagan kings of Munster, Connaught, Leinster, and Ulster. Finally, we must consider the practices and claims of modern groups who identify as Druids, and examine whether any genuine continuity can be established with their ancient predecessors. What lies ahead, then, is a journey spanning nearly 3,000 years, one that begins on the fringes of the Mediterranean world, passes through Iron Age Britain, Gaul, and Ireland, and ultimately arrives in modern Europe and North America. Let us begin. In this section, we will focus on the first two categories of evidence, both of which relate to the Iron Age Druids of Britain and Gaul. We will start with the earliest written descriptions of Western Europe, produced during a period when Greek colonies flourished along the Mediterranean coasts of Gaul and Hispania. From there, we will trace later accounts spanning the era of Roman expansion beyond the Alps, through to the full incorporation of both Gaul and Britain into the Roman world. We will then turn to the Christian writers of the late Roman Empire. By this point, the Druids appear to have largely vanished from their traditional strongholds, either suppressed or absorbed by the changing religious landscape. Following this textual survey, we will examine the archaeological record of modern France and Britain to assess whether any meaningful parallels can be drawn between known Iron Age religious practices and the descriptions provided by contemporary observers. Before engaging with these sources, however, it is essential to acknowledge a significant obstacle that has long hindered scholarly attempts to form a clear and consistent picture of the Druids. Prior to Roman conquest, the societies of Iron Age Gaul and Britain were largely non-literate. As a result, no indigenous written records survive that describe their religious beliefs or institutions from an internal perspective. Compounding this difficulty is the strong likelihood that the Druids themselves deliberately avoided committing their teachings to writing. Classical authors repeatedly suggest that Druidic instruction was transmitted orally, reinforcing the idea that sacred knowledge was meant to be memorized rather than recorded. Consequently, our understanding of the Druids depends almost entirely on the testimony of external observers, many of whom were hostile, dismissive, or deeply biased in their portrayals. Even within these constraints, the surviving evidence is remarkably limited. When all known Greek and Roman references to the Druids are gathered together, they amount to no more than roughly 20 separate accounts, authored by writers scattered across the Mediterranean world. Many of these texts survive only in fragmentary form, preserved indirectly through quotations or summaries written centuries later. In some cases, the existence of an earlier author can only be inferred through the testimony of later writers, while at least one account is widely suspected to have been misattributed entirely. The overall body of material is therefore both sparse and uncertain. As the historian Ronald Hutton observes in his book Blood and Mistletoe, the total surviving material on the Druids would scarcely fill more than a dozen pages, even when printed in large type. Yet despite their brevity, these condensed and often second-hand accounts still offer surprisingly detailed descriptions of practices said to have taken place in Iron Age Gaul and Britain, descriptions that would go on to shape the Druidic image for centuries to come. Taken together, these texts, when read alongside broader evidence for Iron Age societies in these regions, show a general consensus regarding the role attributed to the Druids. Across most accounts, they are described as a combined philosophical and religious elite within British and Gaulish society. Yet when examined more closely, these same sources reveal striking inconsistencies. In certain narratives, the Druids appear as a centralized and unified institution, gathering at a single sacred location under the authority of a chief figure. In others, they are portrayed as merely the most prominent members of a wider class of religious specialists operating within Gallic communities. To address these contradictions, modern historians have grouped the classical evidence into three broad categories. The earliest consists of the writings of Greek explorers and scholars, active in Western Europe during the 3rd and 4th centuries BC. These accounts are the most obscure, surviving almost entirely as quotations or summaries preserved by much later authors. The second and most substantial category is made up of Roman writers. Their descriptions begin with Rome's initial expansion into Gaul and continue through to the apparent disappearance of the Druids by the 2nd century AD. Among all classical sources, these accounts are generally regarded as the most valuable, as their authors were closest in both time and geography to the societies they described in Gaul and Britain. The final group consists of Christian authors writing during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, particularly those associated with the intellectual centers of Alexandria and Antioch. These sources are the least examined and often the most ideologically driven, reflecting a world in which pagan traditions had already begun to fade. We will examine the accounts of each of these three groups in turn, but first it is necessary to establish the wider political context in which they were produced. By the end of the 9th century BC, the Greek world was emerging from a prolonged dark age lasting nearly 4 centuries. This revival was marked by the reappearance of complex city-states and an energetic phase of colonization across the western Mediterranean. By the mid-8th century BC, Greek settlements had been established in southern Italy, Sicily, and on the islands of Corsica and Sardinia. Around the beginning of the 6th century BC, this expansion reached the Atlantic-facing coasts of Gaul and Hispania. Colonies such as Massalia, Emporion, and Agde were founded during this period. It was from this age of exploration and trade that the earliest Greek descriptions of Atlantic Europe emerged. The earliest known account belongs to Hecataeus of Miletus, a 6th century BC scholar who composed one of the earliest geographical treatises around 500 BC. His work, commonly known as Periodos GS, Journey Around the Earth, survives only in fragments. One such fragment contains the earliest recorded use of the term Celts to describe a people living near the Greek colony of Massalia in southern Gaul. This description is echoed by Herodotus in his work, The Histories. Writing in the late 5th century BC, Herodotus placed the Celts among the westernmost peoples of Europe, claiming that they lived beyond the Pillars of Hercules, now identified with the Strait of Gibraltar. While these early Greek accounts provide our first glimpse of the peoples inhabiting Western Europe, they offer little insight into their internal social structures. They contain no detailed descriptions of religious practices and make no mention of any organized priestly class. It would take roughly another century before such a description appeared. Toward the end of the 4th century BC, a treatise titled On the Hyperboreans was composed by Hecataeus of Abdera, a scholar from the city of Abdera. Although this work is also lost, a fragment survives in the writings of Diodorus Siculus, a 1st century BC author. This fragment describes a mysterious island said to lie beyond the lands of the Celts, inhabited by a people known as the Hyperboreans. According to the account, the island lay beyond the reach of the north wind, enjoyed a mild climate, and contained a circular temple dedicated to Hecate, whom the author equated with a Greek deity. The account goes on to describe the temple as richly adorned with numerous votive offerings. According to the fragment, the inhabitants worshipped their deity through the recitation of hymns and communal celebration. The ritual life of the Hyperboreans was said to follow a 19-year cycle, allegedly based on the period required for the stars to return to the same positions in the heavens, a concept often associated with advanced astronomical observation. At the conclusion of each cycle, the god was believed to manifest within the temple itself, an event marked by renewed offerings, ceremonial dancing, and public rejoicing. This fragment represents the earliest surviving reference to a temple-based religious system in Atlantic Europe, as well as the first suggestion of celestial worship in the region. Yet, for all its intrigue, the precise location, or even the cultural reality, of the society it describes cannot be confidently identified. As we shall see, there are compelling reasons to treat this account with caution. For more concrete evidence of religious practices among these Western peoples, we must instead turn to later Greek authors whose observations, though still fragmentary, are somewhat more grounded. One such reference comes from an early 4th century BC philosopher whose work survives only through quotation in the writings of Athenaios, a late 2nd century AD author. In this fragment, it is claimed that the Celts practiced the ritual sacrifice of prisoners taken in war, offering them to their gods. The method described is one of ceremonial burning, a theme that would recur in later Roman accounts. A second testimony is attributed to Timaeus of Tauromenium, an early 3rd century BC writer whose lost works are preserved in excerpts by Diodorus Siculus. Timaeus reports that Celtic communities living along the Mediterranean coast venerated a pair of divine twins and maintained a tradition that these gods had arrived from across the ocean, an origin myth suggestive of maritime symbolism and long-distance cultural memory. A third and more unusual account comes from Dorotheus of Rhodes, writing in the late 3rd century BC. He relates that when the Gauls suffered invasions of locusts, they responded not with force, but with ritual supplication. Through prayers and sacrifices, they believed they could summon flocks of birds to devour the pests. Dorotheus adds that strict taboos surrounded these birds. Any man who harmed one was to be put to death, lest the birds refuse to return when called upon again. While these accounts offer fascinating glimpses into ritual behavior, divine belief, and the perceived relationship between humans, nature, and the gods, they share a notable limitation. None of them explicitly mention the Druids themselves. Instead, they describe religious customs without naming the individuals or institutions responsible for overseeing them. To encounter the Druids directly, we must therefore turn to 2 later texts that unmistakably identify them as a distinct religious class within the societies of Western Europe. As with so many early sources, these works have not survived intact. Their existence is known only through brief quotations preserved in the writings of the late Greek author Diogenes Laertius. Philosophers, Diogenes Laertius makes brief reference to the writings of Sotion of Alexandria, a 2nd century BC thinker, as well as to a work on magic that was widely attributed in antiquity to Aristotle. Within these references appears the earliest unambiguous mention of the Druids. They are described simply as holy men and philosophers of the Celts, listed alongside the learned religious figures of Persia, Babylonia, and India. Compared to these other traditions, the references to the Druids are brief. Nevertheless, one passage is of particular importance, as it offers our first insight into their teachings. We are told that the Gymnosophists, Magi, and Druids expressed their philosophy through riddles, instructing people to honor the gods, refrain from wrongdoing, and cultivate courage. Though concise, this description would prove foundational in shaping later interpretations of Druidic wisdom. A further account comes from an otherwise obscure 2nd century BC poet, Nicomander of Colophon, whose work survives only through quotation by later authors, including Julian the Apostate in the 3rd century AD. According to this poet, Celtic religious practitioners engaged in necromantic rituals, communing with the dead in order to foretell future events. To accomplish this, they were said to spend entire nights beside the graves of the deceased, seeking enlightenment through dreams. These practices suggest a belief in the permeability of the boundary between the living and the dead, and the use of liminal spaces as sources of sacred knowledge. What then can be drawn from this small collection of early references? It is tempting to view them as offering a preliminary picture of religious life in Atlantic Europe. one that includes elements of celestial worship, votive offerings, and ritual interaction with the dead. This interpretation has been especially attractive to later scholars and antiquarians. One of the earliest proponents of this view was John Toland, writing in the 17th century. Toland attempted to identify the temple described in the Hyperborean account, with the stone circle at Callanish Stones on the Isle of Lewis. More recently, archaeologist Aubrey Burrell proposed that the 19-year ritual cycle attributed to the Hyperboreans corresponded to the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle observed at several prehistoric monuments in northern Britain, a phenomenon also studied by Barry Cunliffe. Cunliffe further suggested that the Hyperborean narrative may ultimately derive from the lost work of Pytheas of Massalia, a 4th century BC voyager whose travels were roughly contemporary with those of Hecataeus of Abdera. In support of this theory, Cunliffe points to latitude measurements preserved by the later astronomer Hipparchus of Nicaea, who cited Pytheas as his source. One such measurement, 58 degrees and 13 minutes north, passes close to the latitude of the Isle of Lewis. While this hypothesis is intriguing, it rests on uncertain foundations. Chief among the problems is the wildly inconsistent location of Hyperborea across ancient sources. With each successive author, the region appears to drift further north. In the early poetic traditions of Hesiod and Homer, Hyperborea is situated north of mainland Europe, in areas roughly corresponding to modern Romania and Bulgaria. Later writers placed it along the shores of the Black Sea, a region whose geography was already well understood in antiquity. By the time of Hecataeus of Abdera, Hyperborea had been relocated to an island beyond Gaul, while in the 2nd century AD Ptolemy positioned it even farther north, somewhere beyond Ireland in the North Sea. This repeated relocation has led many scholars to conclude that Hyperborea belongs more to the realm of myth than geography. Its shifting position reflects not an expanding map of Europe, but a symbolic edge of the world, a place forever beyond reach. This sense of otherworldliness is already evident in the poetry of Pindar, writing in the 5th century BC. In his Pythian odes, he speaks of Hyperborea as a land of ultimate perfection, declaring that neither ship nor foot may ever reach its wondrous domain. It should also be noted that the principal author responsible for preserving Hecataeus of Abdera's account is Diodorus Siculus, who elsewhere provides separate descriptions of the peoples of Britain in his Bibliotheca Historica. These passages, many of which are thought to derive from the travels of Pytheas of Massalia, make no reference to the Hyperboreans and employ an entirely different set of terms and concepts. On this basis, it appears unlikely that Hecataeus' Hyperborean narrative was drawn directly from Pytheas' observations, although the possibility that Pytheas himself visited regions such as the Isle of Lewis cannot be entirely dismissed. Setting aside this problematic account, what conclusions can we draw from the remaining early sources regarding the Druids? At the very least, we can say with some confidence that a group of Gaulish holy men, known by this title, was recognized in areas surrounding the Greek colonies of southern Gaul by the 2nd century BC. These writers generally portray the group in neutral or even favorable terms, occasionally equating them with the respected philosophical traditions of other cultures. From these accounts, we also learn something of the religious environment in which the Druids operated. Animal sacrifice appears to have been a common means of honoring the gods, a practice broadly comparable to those found in Greek and Roman religion during the same period. We further see the interpretive blending of local deities with members of the Greek pantheon, most notably the identification of native divine twins with Castor and Pollux. At the same time, there are hints of a more violent dimension to Celtic ritual life. Greek authors such as Posidonius describe the sacrificial killing of defeated enemies, particularly in the context of warfare. Crucially, however, these descriptions do not explicitly associate such practices with the Druids themselves, limiting their value for understanding the Druids' precise role within society. For now, then, a direct connection between the Druids and ritual violence remains elusive. To develop a fuller picture, we must turn to later Greek and Roman authors who wrote at the moment when Roman power was beginning to exert direct influence over Western Europe. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, the long rivalry between Rome and Carthage was approaching its climax. Since the mid-3rd century BC, the two powers had been locked in a series of escalating political and military confrontations, including two major wars fought over control of Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia. The second of these conflicts, the Second Punic War, ended in 201 BC with a decisive Roman victory, forcing Carthage to relinquish its remaining European territories. As a result, Rome suddenly found itself in possession of vast areas of eastern and southern Iberia, much of which had previously been governed by local populations. Over the following decades, Roman authorities struggled to secure control over these new lands. To support military operations and administration, an overland trade route was established across southern Gaul, enabling the movement of troops, supplies, and commercial goods between Italy and Iberia. These routes soon became targets. Throughout the first half of the 2nd century BC, repeated raids by Ligurian tribes disrupted Roman communications. Among them, the Saliers, or Saluvii, emerged as a significant threat to Rome's Greek ally, the city of Massalia. In 125 BC, after repeated appeals for assistance from Massalia, Rome intervened militarily. 2 years later, a Roman army led by Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus crushed the Salias and destroyed their principal stronghold. In the years that followed, Roman forces advanced steadily into the interior of Gaul. The decisive moment came in 121 BC, when Roman armies inflicted a crushing defeat on a coalition of Gallic tribes led by the Arverni and the Allobroge. This victory marked Rome's first permanent foothold in southern Gaul and laid the foundation for sustained Roman involvement north of the Alps, an involvement that would soon bring Roman authors into direct contact with the Druids themselves. This victory eliminated any immediate threat to Rome's overland trade routes and brought the territories of the Allobroge and Arverni firmly under Roman control. In the process, Rome also acquired a narrow strip of Mediterranean coastline from its allies, along which it constructed a strategic road network to link Italy with Hispania. Over the following decades, these lands were consolidated into the new Roman province of Gallia Transalpina, bringing Roman settlers and administrators into sustained contact with the region's indigenous populations. It was against this backdrop of expanding Roman authority that Posidonius, a Syrian-born philosopher, undertook his travels through southern Gaul. Widely regarded as one of the greatest polymaths of his age, Posidonius was a prominent Stoic thinker whose intellectual output spanned geography, mathematics, history, physics, and astronomy. After settling on the island of Rhodes in the early 1st century BC, he embarked on a series of journeys throughout the Roman world, including a detailed exploration of this newly established province. Upon his return to Rhodes, Posidonius composed an extensive cultural and geographical survey of the peoples he had encountered. Although this work has not survived, his immense reputation ensured that later writers drew heavily upon it, sometimes explicitly, sometimes without acknowledgement. This influence is clearly visible in the writings of Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, and it is widely believed that elements of Julius Caesar's account were also shaped by Posidonius's observations. For this reason, modern scholars often group these three authors together as representatives of what is sometimes termed the Posidonian or Massaliote tradition in discussions of the Druids. Within this framework, the Druids are portrayed as the undisputed religious elite of Gaul and Britain, custodians of an extensive body of knowledge encompassing cosmology, natural philosophy, and herbal medicine, and serving as arbiters and judges within Gallic society. At the same time, these authors also echo earlier Greek traditions by attributing to the Druids a central role in the supervision of human sacrifice, rituals that Roman observers regarded as profoundly alien and barbaric. This dual portrayal, combining philosophical authority with ritual violence, would become one of the most enduring and controversial features of the classical image of the Druids. We will return to what can be reconstructed of Posidonius's lost writings in due course. For now, however, we must begin with the most influential and detailed account of the Druids to survive from this group, that of Julius Caesar himself. Writing some 50 years after Posidonius's journey through Gaul, Caesar described a world that had been dramatically transformed in the intervening decades. By this time, anxiety within Roman society regarding the so-called Gallic threat had intensified. Memories of earlier incursions by northern tribes still lingered, and fears of renewed invasions across the Alps continued to shape Roman political thinking. It was within this climate of suspicion and expansion that Caesar's depiction of the Druids would emerge, one that would ultimately define how they were remembered for centuries to come. These anxieties were intensified by the migration of several Germanic groups through Gaul, including the Cimbri, Ambronese, and Teutones. During the final decades of the 2nd century BC, these peoples launched repeated incursions into Roman territory, deepening fears of another catastrophic invasion from the north. The threat was finally neutralized in 101 BC, when Roman forces under Gaius Marius decisively defeated the Teutones and their allies, effectively destroying their armies. Despite these victories, the independent tribes of northern Gaul continued to loom large in the Roman imagination. This lingering sense of insecurity would later be exploited by Julius Caesar, who cited the instability of the region as justification for launching his Gallic campaigns in 58 BC. It was at the conclusion of this prolonged conflict, some 8 years later, that Caesar composed and published his Commentary de Bello Gallico. Alongside a detailed narrative of his military achievements, the work contains extended descriptions of Gallic society, in which the Druids occupy a central place. According to Caesar, Gallic society was dominated by two elite classes. One consisted of the warrior aristocracy, often translated as knights or nobles, while the other comprised the Druids. The responsibilities of the Druids extended across religious and civic life. They presided over public and private sacrifices, interpreted divine signs, and served as judges in disputes and criminal cases, particularly those arising during wartime. Caesar further notes that the Druids enjoyed significant privileges. They were exempt from military service and taxation, benefits that made entry into their ranks highly attractive. As a result, many young men sought Druidic instruction, drawn by both the prestige of the role and the protections it afforded. Becoming a Druid, however, was no small undertaking. Caesar claims that their education could last as long as 20 years. Those seeking advanced instruction were said to travel to Britain, which he describes as the birthplace of Druidic learning and the spiritual heart of their religious tradition. Central to their teachings, he writes, was the belief in the transmigration of the soul, that death marked not an end, but a transition into another body. This doctrine, Caesar suggests, fostered bravery by diminishing fear of death among warriors. Beyond theology, Druidic education encompassed a wide range of subjects, including astronomy, cosmology, natural philosophy, and the workings of the divine. Despite this breadth of knowledge, the Druids deliberately avoided committing their teachings to writing. Caesar offers two explanations for this prohibition. First, to prevent sacred knowledge from becoming widely accessible, and second, to strengthen the memory and mental discipline of their students. Most strikingly, Caesar presents the Druids as a unified institution. He describes them as operating under a single elected leader, whose authority was recognized across Gaul. If succession was disputed, leadership could be decided by force of arms. Each year, the Druids were said to convene in the territory of the Carnutes, a central location where they adjudicated disputes brought from across the Gallic world. At this point in Caesar's narrative, a darker tone emerges. After briefly outlining the role of the warrior elite, he abruptly turns to the subject of human sacrifice. According to his account, the Druids presided over these rituals as their principal officiants. It is here that we encounter some of the most enduring and controversial descriptions of Druidic practice, accounts that would profoundly shape Roman and later perceptions of the Druids as both philosophers and practitioners of extreme ritual violence. Caesar goes on to claim that when communities were afflicted by disease or faced the prospect of war, human sacrifice was employed to appease the gods. In some regions, he reports, these rituals involved the construction of enormous effigies made of wicker, which were filled with sacrificial victims and then set ablaze. Those selected were often criminals or thieves, though Caesar adds that when such individuals were unavailable, innocents might also be used. He concludes his ethnographic account by outlining the Gallic pantheon, which he directly equates with the gods of Rome. According to Caesar, the chief Gallic deity corresponded to Mercury, whom he describes as the inventor of the arts, the patron of travelers, and the god of commerce and wealth. Alongside him, the Gauls were said to venerate Apollo, Jupiter, Minerva, and, above all, Mars, the god of war. Special reverence, Caesar notes, was reserved for Mars. Before entering battle, Gallic warriors dedicated their spoils to him, and following victory, captives were sacrificed in his honor, while the remaining booty was deposited in sacred sites. Caesar ends by attributing to the Druids a distinctive teaching regarding time and ancestry. They claimed that the Gauls were descended from a god of the underworld, and for this reason reckoned time by nights rather than days. Given Caesar's prolonged military presence in Gaul and his familiarity with its societies, it is tempting to accept his account largely at face value. Much of his description is likely grounded in genuine observation. Nevertheless, there are compelling reasons to question certain elements of his portrayal. One issue lies in internal contradictions. Caesar states that the authority of the Druids increased during times of crisis, yet he also insists that they held themselves aloof from warfare. This latter claim appears to conflict with other contemporary Roman testimony, most notably that of Cicero, a prominent politician and at times a rival of Julius Caesar. In his treatise on divination, Cicero remarks that he could personally attest to the existence of Druidic practices, having encountered a Druid himself while in Rome. This individual, named Diviciacus, is described as employing augury, interpreting the movements of birds and other natural phenomena in order to predict future events. The same Diviciacus appears in Caesar's writings as well, but in a very different role. Rather than being identified as a Druid, he is presented as a leading Gallic aristocrat and a political ally of Rome. If both accounts refer to the same individual, then Cicero's testimony complicates Caesar's claim that Druids were entirely detached from warfare and politics. Instead, it suggests a degree of overlap between religious authority and secular leadership, blurring the boundaries between the Druids and the ruling elite of Gallic society. This tension between the sources raises important questions, not only about the precise role of the Druids, but also about the extent to which Caesar's portrayal was shaped by Roman expectations, political motives, or rhetorical strategy rather than by strict ethnographic accuracy. It should be noted, however, that Cicero's testimony aligns with several elements of Julius Caesar's account, particularly regarding the existence of human sacrifice among the Gauls. At the same time, it is important to remember that Caesar was an exceptionally ambitious figure, one acutely aware of how to shape his narrative for a Roman audience. The image he presents of the peoples he conquered, including those of Gaul and coastal Britain, often emphasizes elements that would have appeared familiar and reassuring to Roman readers. In Caesar's depiction, Gallic society appears structured and orderly. It possesses an organized priesthood, a defined noble class, and a religious system that could be comfortably mapped onto Roman concepts. Native deities are equated with Roman gods, and the practice of animal sacrifice, an essential component of Roman religion, is presented as both recognizable and respectable. By contrast, the peoples who lay beyond his control are portrayed in far harsher terms. This contrast is most evident in Caesar's descriptions of the Germanic tribes along the frontier of Belgica. Here, he depicts his opponents as untamed barbarians, ignorant of Roman gods and unfamiliar with what he regarded as proper forms of worship. Notably, he emphasizes their lack of Druids, implicitly denying them the civilizing influence he attributed to their Gallic neighbors. He even claims that they were unfamiliar with agriculture, a charge he also levels against the inhabitants of inland Britain, assertions that are now known to be contradicted by the archaeological record. As a result, a number of modern scholars, including Barry Cunliffe and Ronald Hutton, have argued that these distortions were deliberate. By presenting Gallic society as at least partially civilized, complete with priests, laws, and social hierarchy, Caesar could justify its incorporation into an expanded Roman state. Conversely, by depicting the Germans and certain Britons as irredeemably savage and ungovernable, He provided a convenient explanation for his failure to extend Roman rule into those regions. This tendency towards self-serving narrative construction was recognized even by Caesar's contemporaries. The historian Gaius Asinius Pollio famously remarked that Caesar was prone to accepting others' accounts of events too readily, while offering an unreliable version of his own actions, whether intentionally or through careless omission. If we move beyond Caesar's writings, the next explicit references to the Druids do not appear for several decades. In the intervening period, the political landscape of the Roman world was radically transformed. Following Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, power was divided among an uneasy alliance formed by his adopted heir Octavian, alongside the generals Mark Antony and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a political arrangement that would soon reshape Rome's relationship with the provinces and the traditions they contained. This alliance, known as the Second Triumvirate, governed the Roman state until 33 BC, when relations between Octavian and Mark Antony finally collapsed. The ensuing civil war culminated in Octavian's decisive victory at the Battle of Actium, after which Antony took his own life. With no remaining rivals, Octavian emerged as the uncontested ruler of the Roman world. Rather than openly dismantling the Republic, Octavian consolidated power gradually, accumulating unprecedented senatorial authority while preserving the outward appearance of republican institutions. In 27 BC, he and the Senate agreed upon what became known as the First Settlement. Through this arrangement, Octavian was granted the honorific title Augustus, meaning the illustrious one, along with the designation Princeps, or First Citizen. In all but name, the Roman Empire had now come into being. It is against this backdrop, the transition from republic to empire, that the next major literary accounts of the Druids appear, authored by Strabo and Diodorus Siculus. Both men lived and wrote within the Roman Mediterranean world, and their descriptions of the Druids clearly draw upon Caesar's earlier work. While they largely accept his portrayal of the Druids as a learned and authoritative religious elite, they also introduce new details that complicate the picture. Some scholars have suggested that these additions derive from the influence of Posidonius, whom Strabo cites elsewhere in his writings, though not explicitly in the sections dealing with the Druids. Of the two authors, it is Diodorus who offers the more detailed discussion of Gallic religious life in his Bibliotheca Historica. He begins by echoing Caesar's account, describing the deposition of votive offerings, particularly gold, made by the Gauls in honor of their gods. Diodorus then introduces a notable innovation. He claims that the Gallic belief in the transmigration of the soul was derived from the teachings of Pythagoras, a 6th century BC thinker who established a philosophical school in southern Italy. According to Diodorus, this belief was so firmly held among the Gauls that letters addressed to the deceased were sometimes cast onto funeral pyres, in the expectation that the dead would be able to read them in their next existence. This explicit identification of Druidic doctrine with Pythagorean philosophy has long troubled modern scholars. Much of what we know about Pythagoras' life and teachings is uncertain, as nearly all contemporary accounts have been lost, and later traditions are often anecdotal or satirical. Early critics such as Xenophanes and Heraclida, writing in the early 5th century BC, openly mocked Pythagoras for his belief in reincarnation. Xenophanes famously recounts an episode in which Pythagoras intervened to stop a dog from being beaten, claiming he recognized the voice of a deceased friend in its cries. Such stories highlight both the controversial nature of Pythagorean beliefs in antiquity and the difficulty of tracing a clear intellectual lineage between Greek philosophy and Druidic teaching. Whether Diodorus was recording genuine cultural transmission, drawing an interpretive analogy for his Greek readers, or repeating a learned speculation remains an open question, one that further complicates our understanding of how ancient authors conceptualized the Druids and their place within the wider philosophical traditions of the ancient world. A brief reference to Pythagoras is repeated roughly half a century later by Herodotus, who again associates him with beliefs concerning the immortality of the soul. By the time of Diodorus Siculus, however, Pythagoras' philosophical tradition had become linked to a broad and often inconsistent body of teachings, encompassing ethics, mathematics, cosmology, and metaphysics. Despite these contradictions, one theme remained central: the doctrine of transmigration, the belief that the soul is reborn into a new body after death. Such a belief would have stood in sharp contrast to mainstream Greek and Roman views, which generally held that the dead passed permanently into the underworld. Diodorus' association of Druidic doctrine with Pythagorean philosophy is therefore best understood not as evidence of a direct intellectual connection, but as an attempt to frame unfamiliar religious ideas using the closest philosophical parallel available to a Mediterranean audience. Moving beyond Pythagoras, Diodorus introduces another detail absent from Caesar's account. He reports that the Gauls preserved the severed heads of particularly distinguished enemies, displaying them as trophies. This practice is corroborated by Strabo, who claims to have observed it personally and records his evident disgust. In both accounts, head-taking is portrayed as an expression of martial pride, an aspect of Gallic culture that Mediterranean writers interpreted as boastful and barbaric. Diodorus further departs from Caesar by describing Gallic society as divided into three distinct religious groups. This tripartite structure, which omits Caesar's warrior aristocracy entirely, is also outlined by Strabo. Together, they identify these groups as the bards, the vates, and the druids. The bards are described as poets and musicians, responsible for song, praise, and the preservation of oral tradition. More significant is the distinction drawn between the vates and the druids. While Caesar assigns both sacrificial and divinatory functions to the druids, Strabo instead presents the druids primarily as philosophers concerned with moral and natural inquiry. In his account, the performance and interpretation of sacrifices fall chiefly to the vates. Despite this division, both authors acknowledge overlap between these roles, noting that no sacrifice could be considered valid without the presence of a philosopher. Both Diodorus and Strabo also maintain that the Druids retained considerable authority during times of war. They claim that Druids possessed the power to halt armed conflict altogether, even to the extent of physically stepping between opposing armies as they advanced toward battle. Finally, both authors agree with Caesar on the existence of human sacrifice among the Gauls and its association with the Druids. However, they expand upon his descriptions, introducing additional methods by which victims were said to be killed, supplementing the infamous wicker effigies with other ritual forms. These elaborations further entrench the image of the Druids as figures of profound authority whose religious power could extend to matters of life, death, and war. Both authors describe a process in which captives and condemned criminals were executed through ritualized means. Victims were reportedly impaled on tall stakes within sacred precincts and then burned as offerings to the gods. In other instances, diviners were said to stab the victim with a dagger or sword and attempt to foretell future events by observing the convulsions of the dying body and the flow of blood. These descriptions reinforce the broader theme of sacrificial divination already present in Caesar's account. Yet despite this general agreement, significant inconsistencies quickly become apparent. In contrast to Julius Caesar, neither Diodorus Siculus nor Strabo describes the Druids as a centralized Gaul-wide institution. They make no mention of a single chief Druid, nor of an annual gathering held to adjudicate disputes across the region. Likewise, neither author refers to active Druidic practice in Britain, despite Caesar's claim that Druidic learning originated there. These discrepancies present two broad possibilities. Either the organization and functions of the Gallic religious elite changed substantially in the decades separating these accounts, or one, or more, of the authors misunderstood or misrepresented the institutions they sought to describe. The first explanation is not implausible. Religious life in Gaul may well have undergone transformation following prolonged Roman rule, as Roman administrative and religious frameworks were gradually imposed upon indigenous traditions. This process may be reflected in the emergence of the Vates, a group whose functions, as described by Strabo and Diodorus, appear to combine elements of two Roman priestly offices. The first of these were the augurs, who interpreted divine will through the observation of birds, their flight patterns and calls. The second were the haruspices, who sought omens by examining the entrails of sacrificial animals, with particular attention paid to the liver. It is possible that what Greek and Roman authors described as the Vates represented a hybrid religious role shaped by increasing Roman influence on native belief systems. At the same time, it is equally possible that such practices long predated Roman involvement. Cicero's earlier attribution of augury to a Druid he encountered in Rome suggests that divinatory practices were already associated with Druids before sustained Roman settlement. Alternatively, the distinction between Druids and Vates may simply reflect confusion on the part of foreign observers. In Latin and Greek usage, terms equivalent to Vates were often employed loosely to mean prophet, seer, or poet, rather than a formally defined priestly class. Finally, it must be remembered that both Diodorus and Strabo were almost certainly drawing, directly or indirectly, from the lost writings of Posidonius. As a result, their descriptions may reflect conditions encountered during the early Roman settlement of Gallia Transalpina, rather than the societies Caesar confronted during his later conquest of northern Gaul. The tripartite division between bards, vates, and druids may therefore have existed earlier and declined by Caesar's time, or it may never have been widespread beyond southern Gaul. Moving forward chronologically, the next reference to the Druids appears in the writings of the Roman geographer Pomponius Mela. In his work De Chorographia, Mela largely reiterates information already familiar from Caesar. However, he introduces one new and noteworthy detail concerning Druidic education. According to Mela, the Druids taught the noblest youths of the nation in private and overextended periods, sometimes lasting as long as 20 years. Instruction was said to take place in secluded caves or deep within inaccessible forests, emphasizing secrecy, isolation, and prolonged oral transmission as defining features of Druidic learning. Growing association between the Druids and wooded landscapes becomes increasingly prominent in the literature of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. In his epic poem Pharsalia, the Roman poet Lucan repeatedly situates the Druids within dark forest groves and for the first time provides recognizably Gallic names for the deities they were said to worship. Among these he lists Isis, appeased through bloodshed, Teutates, associated with grim and violent rites, and Tyrannus, whom Lucan describes as more cruel than the Scythian Diana. Lucan's portrayal is deliberately dramatic and condemnatory. He presents the Druids as custodians of secret and fearsome knowledge, claiming that they alone understood the will of the gods and the hidden powers of the heavens. Dwelling, as he describes it, in remote and shadowed forests, they are said to teach that the dead do not descend to the silent realm of Erebus or the pale kingdom of Pluto, but instead pass into another world where the soul continues its existence. Death, in this view, is merely the midpoint of a longer life. Elsewhere in the Pharsalia, Lucan offers a vivid description of a sacred grove encountered by Julius Caesar during his campaign against Pompey near the Greek city of Massilia. The grove is depicted as ancient and untouched by human hands, its dense canopy blocking out sunlight and imprisoning the air beneath interwoven branches. Lucan emphasizes that no woodland nymphs dwelt there, nor any gentle rural spirits, but rather savage rites and barbarous worship. Massive altars, he claims, were stained with human blood, and grotesque effigies of gods, crudely carved from decaying tree trunks, stood amid black springs and trembling leaves, striking terror into all who approached. Whether rooted in observation or poetic invention, this imagery powerfully reinforced the connection between the Druids, forests, and a sense of primeval dread. Yet it is another author who would leave the most enduring legacy in shaping popular perceptions of Druidic ritual and symbolism. That author is Pliny the Elder, whose encyclopedic work Natural History includes the most detailed surviving description of Druidic herbal lore and medicinal practice. Pliny recounts a ritual in which Druids harvested mistletoe from oak trees, plants he asserts were held in the highest reverence by the Gauls. According to his account, this sacred plant was cut only on the 6th day of the lunar cycle, and its collection was accompanied by ceremonial feasting and the sacrifice of 2 white bulls. It is in this passage that we encounter, for the first time, 2 of the most iconic elements of later Druidic imagery: the white robes worn by the officiating priest, and the golden sickle used to cut the mistletoe. Notably, Pliny mentions these details only in passing, presenting them as practical ritual attire rather than as symbols imbued with deeper meaning. He then adds, with unmistakable irony, that the Druids believed a potion prepared from the mistletoe could cure infertility in livestock, a claim he treats with thinly veiled skepticism. Pliny's account, blending ethnographic curiosity with Roman condescension, would prove enormously influential. More than any other source, it cemented the association between the Druids, sacred trees, herbal knowledge, and arcane ritual, an image that would persist long after the Druids themselves had vanished from the historical record. The distinctive white robes appear once more in Pliny's account, this time in connection with the harvesting of another sacred plant. He describes a ritual involving salago, which was to be gathered using the right hand alone. The hand, Pliny notes, had first to be passed through the folds of the robe, as though the plant were being stolen rather than openly taken. According to his account, the Druids believed salago possessed powerful protective qualities, and that its smoke could be used in the treatment of eye diseases. Pliny's discussion of the Druids is strikingly different from that of other Roman authors. Unlike Julius Caesar, Strabo, or Diodorus Siculus, he shows little interest in the wider structure of Gallic society. He makes no reference to the bards or the vates, nor does he situate the Druids within a broader social hierarchy. Instead, his focus rests almost entirely on ritual practice, herbal lore, and objects imbued with supposed magical properties. Because of this, Pliny's account stands apart from all others. Its unusual content and the authoritative reputation of its author have ensured that it ranks alongside Caesar's work as one of the most frequently cited classical descriptions of the Druids. Its influence is particularly evident in 18th and 19th century imagery, where Druids are rarely depicted without white robes, mistletoe, or golden sickles. Yet just as abruptly as these elements appear in the historical record, they vanish again. No later classical author repeats these details. Even more puzzling is the final episode in Pliny's discussion, which introduces an object unlike anything mentioned elsewhere. After concluding his account of Druidic plant lore and veterinary remedies, Pliny turns to what he describes as a peculiar item venerated by the Gauls. During the summer months, he claims large numbers of snakes would intertwine, producing an egg-like object formed from their saliva and bodily secretions. This object, known as the serpent's egg, was said by the Druids to be expelled into the air amid the hissing of the snakes and had to be caught in a cloak before it touched the ground. Pliny adds that this ritual could only be performed during a specific phase of the moon. He even asserts that he had personally seen one of these objects, describing it as roughly the size of a small apple, with a hard surface marked by shallow indentations. The Druids, he reports, believed the serpent's egg conferred success in legal disputes and helped secure the favor of powerful leaders. Pliny treats these claims with open skepticism. He recounts the story of a man from the Conti tribe who concealed one of these objects in his cloak while standing trial before Claudius. When the object was discovered, the man was executed, an anecdote Pliny presents as evidence of both the superstition of the Gauls and the folly of believing in such talismans. No other ancient author mentions serpents' eggs, leaving modern scholars uncertain as to Pliny's source. Whether this account reflects a misunderstood folk belief, a symbolic ritual object, or simply an anecdote embellished for rhetorical effect remains impossible to determine. What is clear, however, is that Pliny's portrayal, more than any other, cemented the image of the Druids as practitioners of secretive, plant-centered rites, surrounded by objects of mysterious and arcane power. Alongside the growing association of the Druids with forests and remote landscapes, the writings of 1st and 2nd century AD authors also reflect an increasingly hostile attitude toward their order. It is within these texts that we first encounter explicit references to state repression directed against Druidic practices. Both Pliny the Elder and Lucan denounce the Druids in uncompromising terms, portraying their rites as barbaric survivals that, according to Pliny, continued to exist in Gaul even during his own lifetime. Pliny further claims that the persistence of these practices prompted Roman authorities to act decisively. He attributes the formal suppression of the Druids to the reign of Tiberius, who is said to have issued a decree outlawing the Druids, along with other groups labeled as diviners and healers. In one of his most vehement passages, Pliny asserts that the Romans could at least take pride in having eradicated what he describes as murderous cults, practices involving human sacrifice and even ritual cannibalism. This account of repression is echoed by the early 2nd century AD biographer Suetonius. In his The 12 Caesars, Suetonius claims that membership in the Druidic order had first been prohibited to Roman citizens under Augustus. He then goes further than Pliny by assigning final responsibility for the destruction of the Druids to Claudius, whom he credits with eliminating what he calls the horrible and inhuman religion of the Gaulish Druids. Taken together, these authors present a picture of a religious institution in terminal decline. From writers such as Mela and Lucan, we see the Druids increasingly associated with marginal spaces, caves, deep forests, and hidden groves, suggesting a retreat from public life. If Pliny and Suetonius are to be believed, by the early 1st century AD, the Druidic order had been systematically suppressed by Roman authority, and may even have ceased to exist altogether. Yet significant uncertainties remain. Both Pliny and Suetonius write as though the Druids had already been destroyed, yet Pliny simultaneously describes rituals that appear to be actively practiced in his own time. This inconsistency raises questions about the extent and effectiveness of Roman repression. Moreover, neither author can be regarded as wholly reliable. Pliny, in particular, is widely acknowledged to provide valuable and often accurate information when describing regions familiar to the Roman world. However, when dealing with distant or poorly understood lands, his accounts frequently stray into the fantastical. In his discussions of Africa, for example, he reports the existence of cyclopes and men with the heads of dogs. Writing about India, he describes a one-legged people, the Monopodes, who supposedly use their single oversized foot as a parasol while lying on their backs. Pliny also records beliefs that were demonstrably false even within Roman society itself, such as the claim that the smell produced by extinguishing a lamp could induce miscarriage in women. These examples serve as a reminder that his work, while invaluable, must be approached with caution, particularly when assessing extraordinary claims about foreign religious practices. As a result, while Roman authors clearly believed that Druidism had been suppressed or eradicated, the reality may have been far more complex. Rather than disappearing entirely, Druidic traditions may have adapted, retreated from public view, or survived in altered forms beyond the reach of Roman authority. An issue that becomes even more pressing when we turn to the evidence from Britain and Ireland. Alongside the growing association of the Druids with forests and remote landscapes, the writings of 1st and 2nd century AD authors also reflect an increasingly hostile attitude toward their order. It is within these texts that we first encounter explicit references to state repression directed against Druidic practices. Both Pliny the Elder and Lucan denounce the Druids in uncompromising terms, portraying their rites as barbaric survivals that, according to Pliny, continued to exist in Gaul even during his own lifetime. Pliny further claims that the persistence of these practices prompted Roman authorities to act decisively. He attributes the formal suppression of the Druids to the reign of Tiberius, who is said to have issued a decree outlawing the Druids, along with other groups labeled as diviners and healers. In one of his most vehement passages, Pliny asserts that the Romans could at least take pride in having eradicated what he describes as murderous cults, practices involving human sacrifice and even ritual cannibalism. This account of repression is echoed by the early 2nd century AD biographer Suetonius. In his The 12 Caesars, Suetonius claims that membership in the Druidic order had first been prohibited to Roman citizens under Augustus. He then goes further than Pliny by assigning final responsibility for the destruction of the Druids to Claudius, whom he credits with eliminating what he calls the horrible and inhuman religion of the Gaulish Druids. Taken together, these authors present a picture of a religious institution in terminal decline. From writers such as Mela and Lucan, we see the Druids increasingly associated with marginal spaces, caves, deep forests, and hidden groves, suggesting a retreat from public life. If Pliny and Suetonius are to be believed, by the early 1st century AD, the Druidic order had been systematically suppressed by Roman authority and may even have ceased to exist altogether. Yet significant uncertainties remain. Both Pliny and Suetonius write as though the Druids had already been destroyed, yet Pliny simultaneously describes rituals that appear to be actively practiced in his own time. This inconsistency raises questions about the extent and effectiveness of Roman repression. Moreover, neither author can be regarded as wholly reliable. Pliny, in particular, is widely acknowledged to provide valuable and often accurate information when describing regions familiar to the Roman world. However, when dealing with distant or poorly understood lands, his accounts frequently stray into the fantastical. In his discussions of Africa, for example, he reports the existence of cyclopes and men with the heads of dogs. Writing about India, he describes a one-legged people, the Monopodes, who supposedly used their single oversized foot as a parasol while lying on their backs. Pliny also records beliefs that were demonstrably false, even within Roman society itself, such as the claim that the smell produced by extinguishing a lamp could induce miscarriage in women. These examples serve as a reminder that his work, while invaluable, must be approached with caution, particularly when assessing extraordinary claims about foreign religious practices. As a result, while Roman authors clearly believed that Druidism had been suppressed or eradicated, the reality may have been far more complex. Rather than disappearing entirely, Druidic traditions may have adapted, retreated from public view, or survived in altered forms beyond the reach of Roman authority, an issue that becomes even more pressing when we turn to the evidence from Britain and Ireland.
Pliny's unreliability is further illustrated by the abundance of misinformation he provides elsewhere, including extravagant claims regarding the supposed dangers of menstrual blood. In light of this, it becomes difficult to determine whether his description of the Druids reflects genuine observation or merely represents hearsay, repeated as fact. Suetonius fares little better in this regard. He is well known for incorporating rumor into his biographies and for presenting personal judgments as objective truth, further complicating efforts to treat his testimony as definitive. There are similarly strong reasons to approach the account of Lucan with caution. For some scholars, his inclusion of named Gallic deities lends a degree of credibility to his writings on native religion. However, his dramatic description of the sacred grove encountered by Caesar's forces is far more problematic. While the episode appears to echo earlier claims of human sacrifice among the peoples of Gaul, the grove itself resembles a Greek-style sacred precinct rather than a distinctly Druidic site. It was located in a coastal region that had been under Greek or Roman cultural influence for centuries, raising doubts about how representative it was of indigenous religious practice. Moreover, Lucan never explicitly identifies the Druids as the custodians of this grove, leaving his intent ambiguous. Despite these uncertainties, it is nevertheless likely that native religious traditions in Gaul had been substantially curtailed by the beginning of the 2nd century AD. By this point, the region had been under Roman rule for more than a century and a half, and any open resistance to Roman religious norms would likely have survived only in isolated and marginal areas. This decline is reflected in the historical record. There is little evidence linking Druids to later Gallic uprisings against Roman authority, suggesting that they no longer functioned as a powerful or organized institution. Perhaps the clearest indication of this waning influence is that, after Suetonius, only a single substantial Roman account of Druidic activity remains, and this one shifts the focus away from Gaul entirely. That final body of evidence concerns Britain, which, following Caesar's expeditions, remained outside direct Roman control for almost a century. During this period, the southern British tribes became increasingly Romanized, likely through sustained trade with the continent and the exchange, and eventual return of elite hostages educated within the Roman system. An attempt to annex Britain was reportedly made during the reign of Caligula, though ancient sources disagree sharply on both its intent and its outcome. Whatever the reality of this episode, it was left to his successor, Claudius, to complete the task. The Roman conquest of Britain unfolded in two major phases. The first, beginning in AD 43, resulted in the occupation of much of southern England. After a pause of roughly a decade, a second wave of campaigns between AD 70 and 80 brought Wales, northern England, and parts of southern Scotland under Roman control. It is within this turbulent context, on the fringes of Roman expansion, that the final classical accounts of the Druids would emerge. It is at the close of this first phase of the Roman conquest that the final substantial classical account of the Druids is set. This account comes from the historian Tacitus, who composed several major works on Roman history in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries AD. In his Annals, Tacitus describes the Roman assault on the Welsh island of Anglesey, known to the Romans as Mona, carried out in AD 60 by the governor Suetonius Paulinus. Tacitus recounts that the native defenders were accompanied by Druids, along with groups of black-clad women who moved among the warriors. Far from remaining detached from violence, these figures appear to have played an active role in the island's defense, chanting incantations and invoking the gods. Tacitus famously writes that the Druids raised their hands to the heavens and poured forth dreadful curses, a spectacle so alien and unsettling that the Roman soldiers momentarily froze in fear, as though paralyzed, leaving themselves exposed to enemy attack. According to Tacitus, Roman discipline soon reasserted itself. The troops overcame their initial shock and inflicted a decisive defeat on the defenders, capturing many of them. The Romans then turned their attention to the island's sacred landscape, destroying groves and altars that Tacitus claims were stained with human blood and the remains of sacrificial victims. Yet this apparent victory proved short-lived. In the same year, Britain was shaken by a massive uprising led by Boudicca, queen of the Iceni. The rebellion forced Roman forces to abandon their hold on Anglesey, which would remain outside Roman control for nearly 2 decades. It was not until AD 77 that the island was finally subdued, when Roman troops under Gnaeus Julius Agricola completed the conquest. Agricola himself had previously served under Suetonius Paulinus during the first campaign, lending continuity to the Roman narrative of the island. At first glance, Tacitus' description of Druidic involvement carries considerable authority. In the very year he records these events, Tacitus had married Agricola's daughter, Julia Agricola, making it likely that his account drew upon first-hand testimony from participants in the campaign, perhaps even Agricola himself. This proximity to the events lends weight to his vivid portrayal of the Druids, their groves, and the rituals attributed to them. Nevertheless, caution remains necessary. Tacitus wrote his account several decades after the events it describes, and there is no way to determine how much these recollections may have been shaped or embellished over time. Memories of dramatic encounters, particularly those involving fear and religious otherness, are especially prone to exaggeration. We must also consider Tacitus' own literary aims. While the Druids feature prominently in his description of the first invasion of Anglesey, they largely disappear from his narrative thereafter, raising questions about how central they truly were to British resistance. Taken together, Tacitus' account provides the last vivid glimpse of the Druids in classical literature, no longer as philosophers or judges, but as figures of resistance, ritual, and terror on the fringes of the Roman world. Whether this image reflects historical reality or the culmination of centuries of Roman anxiety and hostility toward foreign religious authority remains one of the central questions in assessing the legacy of the Druids. If you want, I can continue with the final disappearance of Druids from classical sources, comparison of Gaul versus Britain in Druid survival, or a closing synthesis drawing together all literary evidence. Here is a professional, reorganized continuation, with transcription noise removed, structure refined, and meaning preserved. The tone remains consistent with scholarly documentary narration. Notably, the Druids are entirely absent from Tacitus' earlier biography of Gnaeus Julius Agricola. They do not appear in his account of the second Roman invasion of Anglesey, nor are they mentioned in his description of Agricola's later campaigns in northern England and Scotland. This silence is reinforced by a contemporary narrative from Cassius Dio, who also makes no reference to Druids being present on Anglesey during the Roman assault. Moreover, although Tacitus's annals are often cited as evidence that Anglesey functioned as a major Druidic stronghold, Tacitus himself never explicitly makes this claim. Instead, he characterizes the island primarily as a populous refuge for Britons fleeing Roman expansion. Even so, the destruction of sacred groves described in his account allows for the inference that the island held religious significance and may have served as a sanctuary for Druidic practice. Tacitus makes one further, brief reference to the Druids elsewhere in his writings. In his histories, he recounts a fire that broke out in Rome during the reign of Vespasian, an event which he claims was interpreted by Druids in Gaul as an omen foretelling the imminent downfall of the Roman Empire. This remark appears to contradict the assertions of Pliny the Elder and Suetonius, both of whom imply that Druidism had already been eradicated in Gaul. However, the year Tacitus refers to, AD 70, slightly predates the composition of their accounts, leaving open the possibility that Druidic traditions still lingered at that time. Beyond Tacitus, the classical record grows increasingly thin. There are no further substantive references to Druids in Roman Britain, suggesting that any surviving practices there were either suppressed or driven beyond the reach of Roman authors. The few remaining mentions instead concern Gaul, with 3 notable examples preserved in a single problematic source. These appear in the Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies likely composed in the 4th century AD. Within this text, 3 emperors, Alexander Severus, Aurelian, and Tsar Diocletian, are each described as encountering Gallic Druids who accurately foretold their futures. These anecdotes have received little serious attention from historians, as the Historia Augusta is now widely regarded as unreliable, often characterized as satire, fabrication, or a mixture of both. Yet despite its dubious historical value, the Historia Augusta introduces an intriguing idea worthy of closer examination: the existence of female Druids. Although Greek and Roman authors provide few explicit references to Druids after the early imperial period, they do offer scattered evidence for female religious figures within the societies of both Gaul and Britain. Beyond the black-clad women described by Tacitus, who appear to have actively encouraged British resistance, we also find a striking example in the writings of Strabo, who recounts the activities of Gallic priestesses whose roles suggest an organized and influential female religious presence. It is to these figures, and what they may reveal about the diversity of religious authority in the Celtic world, that we must now turn. Posidonius, Strabo describes a group of women belonging to the Namnetes, who were devoted to the Greek god Dionysus. According to his account, these women lived on an island at the mouth of the Loire River, where they maintained a sacred temple. Men, Strabo tells us, were forbidden to set foot on the island, although the women themselves periodically returned to the mainland to seek sexual partners. Strabo further claims that once each year, the women ritually dismantled and rebuilt the roof of their temple. During this ceremony, the first woman to drop her burden was said to be torn apart by the others, her dismembered body carried around the sanctuary amid ritual cries. This dramatic account, however, is almost certainly based on second-hand reports. Strabo relied on earlier sources, and there is no evidence that Posidonius himself ever traveled as far north as the Loire estuary. The malleable nature of this tradition is further illustrated by a similar account recorded by Pomponius Mela. In his version, 9 women lived on an island between Gaul and Britain, where they acted as powerful prophetesses. Unlike Strabo's priestesses, these women were described as perpetual virgins, endowed with the ability to foretell the future, control the seas, and heal the sick. We will return to the question of female druids and prophetic women in a later discussion. Before doing so, however, we arrive at the final Roman-era reference to the Druids. This appears in the writings of the 4th century AD poet Ausonius, in his work Professores Burdigalenses. Here, Ausonius briefly mentions a man who claimed descent from the Druids of Aquitaine and who served as a priest at a temple dedicated to Belenus. He also refers to an elderly man named Fabricius, said to be descended from the Druids of Armorica, who served as a priest of Balinus. In these late references, we see a striking reversal in tone. No longer are the Druids portrayed as savage practitioners of human sacrifice. Instead, they appear as respectable ancestral figures, their traditions safely relegated to the distant past. By this point, whatever threat they once posed to Roman authority had long since faded, and a measure of nostalgia, or even local pride, had begun to attach itself to their memory. So what, ultimately, can be made of the Greek and Roman accounts of the Druids? It is difficult to read them without detecting elements of propaganda. Alongside descriptions of human sacrifice, these authors consistently portray the peoples of Gaul and Britain in ways that align closely with Roman stereotypes of barbarism. In the works of Diodorus Siculus and Strabo, the Gauls are depicted as boastful, prone to threats, and fond of displaying the severed heads of defeated enemies. In the case of Britain, authors such as Julius Caesar and Strabo emphasize supposed ignorance of agriculture and proper clothing, claiming that the inhabitants dressed themselves in animal skins. For Pliny the Elder, Gallic society was steeped in superstition, an attitude he treats with open mockery. Tacitus, meanwhile, presents the Britons as being ruled by women, a condition he implies would have been viewed in the Roman world as a sign of weakness and disorder. Equally revealing is the way the tone of these accounts shifts over time. In Caesar's writings, the Druids and their practices are described with relatively little overt moral judgment. Strabo and Diodorus Siculus similarly frame many of the more extreme practices as belonging to an earlier age. By the time of Lucan, Pliny the Elder, and Suetonius, however, the tone hardens considerably. These authors express explicit hostility toward the Druids, with Pliny and Suetonius openly endorsing their suppression. A similar antagonism underpins Tacitus's depiction of the Druids in Britain, where he attributes to them the darkest aspects of native resistance and religious violence. Taken together, these evolving portrayals tell us as much about Roman fears, values, and political priorities as they do about the Druids themselves. A reminder that every ancient description is shaped not only by what was observed, but by who was doing the observing and why. By the 4th century AD, after the apparent destruction of the Druids in both Gaul and Britain, these hostile portrayals largely disappear from the historical record. Whatever threat the Druids were once believed to pose to Roman authority seems to have been neutralized so completely that they could now be remembered without fear. Indeed, respectable Roman citizens were increasingly willing to regard them as distant, even honorable ancestors, rather than dangerous subversives. Given this dramatic shift in tone, and the Romans' well-documented tendency to depict foreign peoples in an unfavorable light, both historians and archaeologists have long suggested that spurious or exaggerated elements may have entered the classical accounts. Unsurprisingly, the greatest scrutiny has been directed toward claims of human sacrifice, which some scholars argue reflect Roman stereotypes of barbarism rather than objective observation. Figures such as Sir John Rees, Nora Chadwick, and Ash T.F. O'Reilly have argued that the more extreme rituals attributed to the Druids can be dismissed entirely. In their view, the Druids were primarily an elite philosophical and intellectual class, and no pre-Roman source conclusively links them to human sacrifice. By contrast, Stuart Piggott regarded the Roman depictions as broadly realistic, while Ronald Hutton, perhaps the most skeptical voice in the debate, has emphasized that we possess no reliable means of determining which elements of these accounts are factual and which are distortions. Other archaeologists, including Jane Webster, Miranda Green, and Barry Cunliffe, have been more receptive to the possibility that ritual violence formed part of Iron Age religious life. They point to archaeological evidence from both Gaul and Britain that suggests sacrificial activity, though rarely in forms that can be unequivocally tied to Druids themselves. Before turning directly to this archaeological material, however, two further categories of evidence deserve brief attention. The first consists of the final group of ancient writers to mention the Druids, the so-called Alexandrian authors, named for the city where many of them lived and worked. Writing between the 2nd and 4th centuries AD, these authors present a markedly different image of the Druids from that found in earlier Roman literature. The earliest of these is Dio Chrysostom, writing at the beginning of the 2nd century AD. In his account, the Druids appear simply as wise men among the Celts, respected diviners and advisors to kings. Indeed, Dio suggests that these societies were so thoroughly guided by their Druids that true authority rested with them rather than with secular rulers. A later perspective is offered by the early Christian writer Schoth Hippolytus of Rome, who revives the association between Druidic teaching and Pythagoras, first proposed by Diodorus Siculus. Hippolytus claims that these doctrines were transmitted to the Druids by a Phrygian slave in Greece named Zamolxis, who allegedly traveled to Gaul as a missionary following his master's death. This supposed connection between Druidism and Greek philosophy is further echoed by Clement of Alexandria, who similarly frames Druidic wisdom as part of a broader ancient philosophical tradition. In these late accounts, the Druids are no longer feared as barbaric ritualists, but reimagined as sages whose teachings could be harmonized, however imperfectly, with classical and Christian intellectual history. Together, these Alexandrian perspectives underscore how dramatically the image of the Druids had changed by late antiquity, shaped less by first-hand observation than by philosophical speculation and theological agenda. In contrast to Hippolytus of Rome, Clement of Alexandria advances a strikingly different claim. Rather than suggesting that Druidic teachings were derived from Greek philosophy, Clement argues that Pythagorean principles were in fact taught to the Greeks by the Gauls, and that this philosophical tradition originated among them. He adds that the Greeks themselves had inherited much of their wisdom from peoples they later labeled as barbarians, including the Assyrians and the Brahmins of India. The final Roman historian of note to mention the Druids is Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century AD. In his work, Res Gestae, the Druids once again appear alongside the bards and the Vates. While the overall structure of this threefold division echoes earlier accounts, Ammianus subtly reshapes their roles. The Vates are no longer described primarily as seers, but as investigators of hidden truths and the secret laws governing nature. The Druids, by contrast, are portrayed as occupying the highest intellectual rank, devoted to profound philosophical inquiry, and once again associated with the teachings of Pythagoras. The image of the Druids that emerges from these late accounts bears a closer resemblance to the earliest Greek descriptions of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC than to the hostile Roman narratives of the early empire. Many of these authors appear to rely on much older sources, including references attributed to Diogenes Laertius, lost works of Posidonius, and texts falsely attributed to Aristotle that were discussed earlier. In the case of Ammianus, scholars have suggested that he may have been drawing from a corrupted or abbreviated version of a lost work by a 1st century BC Greek author named Timagenes. What is particularly notable across all of these late sources is what they omit. None attribute human sacrifice to the Druids, nor do they offer detailed descriptions of ritual practice. Instead, the Druids are remembered almost exclusively as philosophers, sages, and guardians of ancient wisdom. These portrayals must also be understood within the dramatically altered religious landscape of late antiquity. By the time these authors were writing, traditional Roman religion had itself been eclipsed by Christianity. In AD 313, Constantine the Great issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity throughout the empire. Over the following decades, successive emperors steadily dismantled Rome's traditional religious institutions. After the death of Julian the Apostate in AD 363, all subsequent emperors were Christians. By the end of the 4th century, under Theodosius I, Christianity had effectively become the state religion. Against this backdrop, the Druids, long detached from political power and no longer associated with active pagan resistance, could be reimagined as benign ancestral figures, an ancient house of wisdom distinct from the now discredited paganism of Greece and Rome. A final comparative perspective can be drawn between the Gauls of the 1st century BC and another Celtic-speaking group of the same era, the Galatians of northern Anatolia. These Celtic migrants had moved into the Balkans during the early 3rd century BC before advancing into Macedonia and central Anatolia. Although their advance was ultimately halted before reaching the sanctuary of Par, Temple of Apollo at Delphi, a splinter group continued eastward, settling permanently in what would become known as Galatia. This comparison offers a useful reminder. Celtic societies were neither isolated nor static, and their religious traditions, like those of the Druids, were shaped by migration, cultural exchange, and the interpretive lenses of foreign observers. After crossing into Anatolia, this Celtic force spent several years operating as mercenaries. Eventually, under the patronage of Nicomedes I, they were granted land in central Anatolia, a region that thereafter became known as Galatia. Two detailed descriptions of Galatian society have survived, provided independently by Strabo and Pliny the Elder. Both authors describe a society divided into 3 tribes, each governed by 4 tetrarchs. These tetrarchs were supported by officials who acted as judges and military commanders. Notably, the judicial figures appear to have fulfilled many of the same roles attributed to Druids in Roman descriptions of Gaul, arbitrating disputes and overseeing legal matters. Curiously, however, neither Strabo nor Pliny mentions Druids in their accounts of Galatia, despite both authors discussing Druids elsewhere in the same works when describing Gaul. This omission is striking and suggests that Druidism was not a universal or essential feature of all Celtic-speaking societies. It must be acknowledged, however, that the Galatian society described by these authors was separated by more than 2 centuries from its Celtic origins. During that time, prolonged exposure to Anatolian, Greek, and Roman cultural influences may well have transformed or replaced earlier religious structures. Taking all of these literary accounts together, what conclusions can be drawn about the Druids? For many scholars, the answer is paradoxical, both everything and nothing. Any individual detail preserved in the classical sources may be accurate or entirely fictional. Without written testimony from the peoples of Gaul or Britain themselves, there is no way to conclusively verify these narratives. What is available to us, however, is the archaeological record of the regions in which the Druids are said to have operated. Before turning to that evidence, it is necessary to address several persistent misconceptions regarding the sites traditionally associated with Druidic worship. In popular culture, the Druids have long been linked to monumental ritual landscapes such as Stonehenge, Avebury, Newgrange, and the great megalithic complexes of Brittany, including the Carnac stones. This association was first proposed by antiquarians of the 17th century and remained dominant among scholars well into the 19th. Even today, these sites continue to play a central role in modern Druidic movements. Hundreds of adherents gather at them each year to mark the summer and winter solstices. Many of these monuments are indeed astronomically aligned, and contemporary practitioners often interpret these moments symbolically as thresholds between death and rebirth, when the sun reaches its weakest point before returning. However, while these celestial alignments were undoubtedly significant to the original builders, modern archaeology has demonstrated that the tradition of megalithic construction long predates any historical reference to the Druids. The majority of these monuments date to the Neolithic period, with the earliest appearing several millennia before the first written accounts of Celtic societies. This monumental tradition continued over an extended span of time, with many sites undergoing successive phases of construction and modification. In Brittany, the Carnac alignments were erected between the 5th and 4th millennia BC. At Stonehenge, the initial earthworks, ditches, and banks were created toward the end of the 4th millennium BC, followed by multiple stages of stone construction over the next 15 centuries. By the time Druids first appear in the historical record, these sites were already ancient relics of a distant past. Their enduring presence in the landscape may well have lent them an aura of sanctity, but there is no evidence that they were built by or exclusively associated with the Druids themselves. If you'd like, I can continue with Iron Age ritual sites actually associated with Celtic religion, evidence for sacrifice in the archaeological record, or a final synthesis, what archaeology can and cannot tell us about the Druids. Alongside henges and standing stones, the Neolithic and early Bronze Age also witnessed the construction of large communal barrows, passage graves, and associated timber structures, such as those uncovered at Woodhenge. By the Middle Bronze Age, however, around 1500 BC, this tradition of monumental construction largely came to an end. There is little evidence to suggest continued ritual use of sites such as Stonehenge or Avebury beyond sporadic and much later Roman activity. As a result, there is no credible evidence linking the Druids to the great megalithic monuments of Northern Europe. Their historically attested period lies many centuries after these sites were abandoned or, in the case of Neolithic tombs, sealed. While it is tempting to speculate that ritual traditions may have been transmitted across generations, from the end of the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, current archaeological evidence suggests that such continuity is unlikely. During the mid-2nd millennium BC, religious practices in Northern Europe underwent a profound transformation. Ritual activity increasingly shifted away from monumental architecture toward natural locations such as springs, rivers, marshlands, and, if we accept the testimony of classical authors, wooded groves. The dominant form of worship became the deposition of votive offerings at these natural sites, producing hoards that often contained high-status items, such as bronze and later iron weapons, tools, and ornaments. Prestige within these societies appears to have become closely associated with access to and control over such valuable objects, before gradually shifting toward ritual feasting and conspicuous displays of consumption. Burial customs changed as well. Cremation became widespread during much of the Bronze Age, only to give way in the Iron Age to a complex and regionally varied mix of inhumation, excarnation, and secondary burial practices. Unfortunately, there is no clear archaeological marker that would allow us to pinpoint where or when the Druids might have emerged within this evolving religious landscape. Earlier scholars often attempted to trace the origins of the Druids to the emergence of the Latène culture from the 5th century BC onward, or to one of its precursors, such as the Hallstatt culture, or the Urnfield traditions of the Late Bronze Age. These cultures are frequently cited as formative stages in the development of Proto-Celtic language and identity, and they show clear continuity with the later Iron Age communities encountered by Greek and Roman authors in Gaul and Britain. If Druids did exist as a distinct religious class in these regions, it is reasonable to assume that they were embedded within societies shaped by these cultural traditions. Yet before we can meaningfully address questions of origin, we must first establish whether the archaeological record of Gaul and Britain aligns in any meaningful way with the classical descriptions of Druidic activity. To do so, we must turn to the material evidence itself and examine known Iron Age religious sites in northwestern Europe. In France, large-scale sanctuaries are known to have existed from the 4th century BC onward. Among the most extensively studied are Gournay-sur-Arronde and Ribemont-sur-Ancre. Both sites began as open-air enclosures defined by palisades and ditches. Within these ditches, archaeologists uncovered substantial deposits of weaponry, tools, jewelry, and the remains of both animals and humans. These enclosures were often complemented by central pits, hollow altars, and monumental entranceways, suggesting a high degree of formal planning and repeated ritual use. It is these Iron Age sanctuaries, rather than the much older megalithic monuments, that offer the most promising archaeological parallels to the religious practices described by classical authors, and provide our strongest material framework for assessing the historical reality of the Druids. Here is a professional, clarified continuation, with transcription noise removed and meaning preserved, maintaining the same scholarly, documentary tone. Comparable enclosed ritual sites are also known from neighboring Rhinopass, Switzerland, and a series of rectangular enclosures, often referred to as Viereckschanzen, have been identified across eastern France and southern Germany. In Britain, ditched enclosures of this type appear to have been less common. Nevertheless, possible parallels have been identified at sites such as Ca Heathrow and Wayland Smithy. In addition, rectangular structures tentatively interpreted as shrines have been discovered within several Iron Age hill forts in southern England, including Cadbury Castle, Danebury, and Maiden Castle. At first glance, the distribution of these sites appears to suggest a broadly shared pattern of religious observance across Iron Age Gaul and Britain, with enclosed spaces set apart from everyday domestic life. Closer examination, however, reveals significant variation. These sanctuaries differ widely in scale and layout, with some containing built structures at their centers rather than open altars. In Britain in particular, formal sanctuaries associated with fixed locations do not appear to have emerged until the very end of the Iron Age. Many of the structures identified as shrines within hill forts are circular rather than rectangular, and there is often little evidence for surrounding enclosures. Nor is there a clear spatial separation between these buildings and more domestic structures, suggesting that ritual and daily life may have been more closely integrated than in parts of Gaul. Further complicating matters, some ditched enclosures, once interpreted as sacred spaces, now appear to have served more practical purposes. In several cases, only limited evidence of ritual activity has been found, far less than at the heavily weapon-laden sanctuaries of northern France. As a result, it has been suggested that some of these sites may have functioned primarily as agricultural facilities, such as grain storage compounds, with no inherent religious significance. Beyond enclosed sanctuaries, Iron Age Gaul also preserves evidence for other forms of ritual centers. One of the most striking examples is the sanctuary of Requec-Pertus in southern France. Occupied between the 6th and 3rd centuries BC, this site was ultimately destroyed during the Roman conquest of the region in the 2nd century BC. Requec-Pertus consisted of a large rectangular platform constructed from stone slabs, incorporating a monumental portal framed by decorated limestone pillars. These pillars featured recessed niches in which human skulls were prominently displayed, providing clear evidence for head veneration. Comparable practices are suggested by finds from Entremont, where carved stone heads have also been uncovered. Similar stone heads found in Britain point to a shared symbolic emphasis on the human head across parts of Iron Age northwestern Europe. Other ritual sites bear little resemblance to enclosed sanctuaries or monumental platforms. Some appear to have been focused almost entirely on votive deposition rather than built structures. A notable example is Fiskerton, where extensive ritual platforms were constructed along a riverbank. Despite the absence of a formal temple complex, vast quantities of bronze objects were deposited in the adjacent water. Comparable watery deposits have also been identified on As Anglesey, long associated with Druidic activity through the account of Tacitus. Here, large assemblages of metalwork have been recovered from the edges of lakes and wetlands, including a distinctive crescent-shaped bronze plaque decorated with lunar motifs. Such finds reinforce the importance of rivers, lakes, and marshes as focal points of ritual activity in Iron Age Britain and Gaul. Settings that align closely with classical descriptions of votive offerings and sacred natural spaces, and which may provide the strongest archaeological parallels to the religious practices attributed to the Druids. Here is a professional, refined continuation, with transcription noise removed, structure clarified, and meaning preserved, maintaining the same academic documentary tone. In addition to water-focused ritual sites, there is also evidence for the existence of wooded sanctuaries in both Gaul and Britain. Although such locations are notoriously difficult to identify archaeologically, their presence is strongly suggested by linguistic evidence. The Gaulish term nemeton, meaning a sacred grove, survives in numerous place names across France and Britain. The term is also referenced by Strabo, and was even applied to the meeting place of the Supreme Council of the Galatians in Anatolia. While this lends support to classical descriptions of sacred groves, the archaeological record offers little evidence for a standardized system of ritual practice shared uniformly across Gaul and Britain. Certain broad patterns do recur, most notably animal sacrifice and the deposition of valuable metal objects, but there is insufficient evidence to suggest that ceremonies followed a single, consistent form across regions. It has also been increasingly argued that the distinction between domestic and ritual space may have been far less rigid than once assumed. In both Gaul and Britain, religious practice appears to have been embedded within everyday life rather than confined to clearly defined sacred precincts. One clear example of this is the deposition of animal, and occasionally human, remains within grain storage pits across southern England, a practice that likely carried ritual significance alongside its practical function. This raises an important question. What kinds of deities were being venerated at these sites? Based on later Roman inscriptions, it is clear that Iron Age Britain and Gaul were home to hundreds of gods and goddesses. Many of these were absorbed into Roman religious practice following conquest, either through direct adoption or symbolic reinterpretation. A small number of deities appear to have enjoyed widespread worship across large parts of northern Europe. These include the horned god Cernunnos, the thunder god Tyrannus, and the horse goddess Epona. Even so, the overwhelming majority of Celtic deities were highly localized, closely associated with specific tribes, landscapes, or ritual centers. Most of our knowledge of these local gods comes from Roman period inscriptions, many of which mention a deity only once. This limited epigraphic footprint should not be mistaken for marginal importance. On the contrary, many of these local gods were likely central to religious life within their core regions. Notable examples include Sequana, whose cult center lay at the source of the Seine in Burgundy, and the British deities Sulis and Nodens, both of whom were worshipped at elaborate temple complexes at Chop Bath and Lydney Park, respectively. In a small number of cases, Celtic gods were incorporated almost wholesale into the Roman pantheon. Epona, for example, became part of the Roman imperial cult as the patron deity of cavalry units. Such cases, however, were exceptional. Far more commonly, Celtic deities were equated with existing Roman gods through a process known as interpretatio Romana. Thus, Acis was identified with Mercury, Tutatis with Mars, and Sulis with Minerva. For much of the 20th century, this process was understood primarily as a pragmatic strategy of Roman administration, allowing local populations to continue venerating familiar gods under the acceptable guise of Roman religion. More recent scholarship, however, has suggested that this syncretism was not merely imposed from above, but often reflected genuine theological overlap and local agency in shaping religious expression under Roman rule. At this point, one final and crucial question remains. Where do the Druids fit into this religious landscape? Here is a professional, refined continuation, with transcription noise removed, structure clarified, and meaning preserved, maintaining the same scholarly tone. Under this interpretive framework, it was long assumed that Iron Age gods and goddesses survived the Roman conquest largely unchanged, continuing to be worshipped under new Roman names. In recent decades, however, this assumption has been increasingly questioned. Archaeologists such as Miranda Green and Andreas Hofenader have argued that the idea of local cults persisting intact beneath Roman titles is overly simplistic. Instead, they suggest that Roman authorities actively reinterpreted and reshaped indigenous religious practices to suit imperial needs, and that this process of adaptation formed a central part of Romanization itself. While local communities may have retained elements of their earlier traditions, the end result was not a unified religious system. This challenges Julius Caesar's depiction of a coherent Gallic pantheon shared across Gaul and Britain. But does the same apply to the priesthoods associated with these cults? Here, the evidence is equally fragmentary. A small number of inscriptions from Roman period Gaul appear to preserve native religious titles, yet strikingly, none mention Druids. Instead, we encounter terms such as vergobret, priest, or sacerdos attached to shrines and votive deposits. One of the most notable examples was discovered on a fragmentary vessel at a Gallo-Roman sanctuary at Entremont, bearing the title vergobret, the same term Caesar uses to describe a leading Gallic magistrate. This inscription was found in territory belonging to the Bituriges, neighbors of the Aedui. Miranda Green has suggested that it may record the participation of a high-ranking official in a votive ritual at the site. If so, it would reinforce earlier indications, such as Cicero's identification of Diviciacus as a Druid, that religious authority and political power often overlapped in Iron Age Gaul. Notably, this inscription dates to the reign of Tiberius, a period during which Pliny the Elder claims Druidic practices had already been outlawed. Even so, these inscriptions provide no evidence for a single, unified priesthood operating across Gaul, standing in sharp contrast to Caesar's account. To reconcile this contradiction, two possibilities present themselves. Either Caesar's description reflects a genuine but simplified understanding shaped by limited knowledge, or it represents a deliberate construction tailored to Roman expectations. If the latter is true, it is striking how readily later authors accepted his framework. Few attempt to name specific indigenous deities or explain the diversity of local cults, one notable exception being the poet Lucan. In his epic poem Pharsalia, Lucan lists 3 deities worshipped by the Gauls: Tydides, Isis, and Ternus. All 3 are independently attested across northern Europe. Inscriptions dedicated to Titates and Tyrannus have been discovered in both Gaul and Britain, often in association with weapons or military equipment. Acis, by contrast, is known from only 2 Gaulish inscriptions, where he is depicted as a male figure engaged in pruning or cutting a tree. Lucan's brief but specific references stand out precisely because they align with the archaeological record in ways most Roman authors do not. Ironically, it is this poetic and highly stylized account, rather than Caesar's ostensibly factual narrative, that most accurately reflects the diversity and locality of Iron Age religious life. Taken together, the evidence suggests that while Druids almost certainly existed as influential religious specialists, they were neither uniform nor omnipresent. Rather than presiding over a centralized priesthood with a standardized theology, they appear to have operated within a fragmented religious landscape, one shaped by local tradition, political authority, and, ultimately, Roman reinterpretation. The third deity, named by Lucan, Tyrannus, is widely attested across northern Europe as a god of thunder. He is frequently depicted in a manner reminiscent of the Roman Jupiter, though often distinguished by the presence of a wheel, an object commonly interpreted as a symbol of the sky, the sun, or cosmic order. Lucan's accurate preservation of indigenous divine names lends a degree of credibility to his account, and later writers would seize upon these references in an effort to reconstruct specific sacrificial rites associated with each deity. According to the medieval text known as the Commenta Bernensia, sacrifices to Tydides were supposedly carried out by drowning victims in a vat of liquid, while those dedicated to Acis were performed by hanging. Worship of Tyrannus, it claims, involved the ritual burning of human victims, a practice that some scholars have attempted to link to the so-called Wicker Man described by Julius Caesar. However, these interpretations must be treated with caution. Neither drowning nor hanging appears in any surviving classical account of Druidic sacrifice, and the Commenta Bernensia itself dates nearly 1,000 years after Lucan's poem. As such, these later attributions tell us far more about medieval speculation than about Iron Age religious practice. Beyond naming deities, Lucan also provides a detail that has drawn particular interest from archaeologists working in southern Gaul. He describes a sacred grove near the Greek settlement of Massilia, in which the gods were worshipped in the form of wooden images. As discussed earlier, wooded sanctuaries are notoriously difficult to identify archaeologically, but wooden figurines dating to the Iron Age have been discovered across much of the Celtic world. Pre-Roman examples have been unearthed in the British Isles, including finds from Argyll, Kingsteinton, and East Yorkshire. A group of 5 wooden figurines has also been discovered near Schraligen, while similar figures from the Roman period have been found at the sanctuary of Chamalières and at the source sanctuary of the river goddess Sequana in Burgundy. Most of these wooden figures date between the 6th and 4th centuries BC and are often interpreted as stylized, cloaked representations of gods or goddesses. With the exception of a small number of earlier examples, possibly dating to the late Bronze Age, their chronological range broadly aligns with the period in which Druids first appear in the historical record. Can these figures be directly linked to Druidic worship? Absolute certainty remains elusive. Nonetheless, it is highly likely that at least some of these objects carried ritual significance. In the case of the Argyll figure, the surrounding archaeological context has been interpreted as the remains of a shrine or enclosed sacred space. Other figures may have served as boundary markers, carved in the likeness of local deities to protect territorial borders and assert spiritual ownership of the landscape. Taken together, these finds suggest a religious world in which images, though rare and highly contextual, played a role alongside natural sanctuaries, votive deposition, and communal ritual. While none of this evidence conclusively proves the hand of the Druids, it does provide a material backdrop that is broadly compatible with the practices attributed to them by ancient authors, reinforcing the view that Druidic activity was embedded within a diverse and regionally varied sacred landscape rather than a single, uniform system of belief. These statues may also represent individuals directly associated with ritual practice, such as priests or officiants, or even local rulers whose authority carried religious significance. This interpretation has been suggested for a bronze figure discovered at Nares-les-Bains in France. The figure depicts a Gaulish warrior adorned with a decorative torque, armor, and shield. And Miranda Green has proposed that it may represent either a warrior deity or a local chieftain elevated to semi-divine status. Alternatively, some figurines may have been intended to represent the worshippers themselves. Evidence for this interpretation can be found among Roman-period votive figurines recovered from sites such as Sceaux Chamalières and the sanctuary of Sequana, where many figures appear to reflect the identities or ailments of pilgrims seeking healing. For earlier Iron Age examples, however, certainty is elusive. Some may simply have served as symbolic offerings, decorative objects, or even items with no ritual function at all. Compounding the difficulty is the lack of a unified iconography. The figures vary widely in form, ranging from crude, featureless wooden effigies to highly detailed bronze representations. Moreover, Lucan mentions such images only in connection with a single grove near Massilia, making it unlikely that his description reflects a standardized or widespread Gaulish ritual practice. As a result, aside from a limited set of common features, such as the names of a few deities, the existence of sacred groves, and the practice of votive deposition, there is surprisingly little overlap between the archaeological record and the detailed narratives provided by Roman authors. In particular, the centralized and ubiquitous priesthood described by Julius Caesar, Strabo, and Diodorus Siculus finds no clear support in inscriptions or material culture. Even the title, Druid itself, is conspicuously absent. This raises an important question. What of ritual objects discovered away from major sanctuaries? Items found in burials, rivers, bogs, or other isolated contexts? It is here that some of the most intriguing evidence for a form of specialist religious role in Iron Age Britain begins to emerge. The first category consists of a small number of unusual headdresses recovered from 6 Iron Age burials across southern England and Wales. The most famous example was discovered in 1988 at Deal, within a male burial dated to between the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. This object, sometimes described as a helmet, features a narrow band encircling the head, with 2 crossing strips forming a cruciform pattern across the crown. Similar headgear has since been identified in finds from Cambridgeshire and Glamorgan, with possible examples also reported from Clwyd and Middlesex. Comparisons have been drawn between these objects and ceremonial headpieces worn by priests in Roman Britain, suggesting a possible ritual function rather than a martial one. Significantly, however, no comparable headdresses have been found in regions where Druids are most often associated in the literary record, such as Gaul or Ireland. This geographic limitation complicates attempts to identify them as universally Druidic. The second class of objects consists of a small group of bronze spoons or scoops discovered in Britain and Ireland, with a single comparable example recovered from eastern France. These enigmatic items are often found in pairs and sometimes bear engraved symbols, leading scholars to speculate that they may have been used in divination or ritual measurement. Taken together, these objects, unusual headdresses and ritual spoons, represent some of the strongest material candidates for identifying a specialist religious role in Iron Age Britain. Whether these individuals were Druids as described by classical authors, or members of a more localized and varied priestly tradition, remains uncertain. What they do suggest, however, is that religious authority in Iron Age societies was expressed materially in subtle and regionally distinct ways, rather than through a single, uniform institution recognizable across the entire Celtic world. Only around 15 examples of these objects are currently known, most of which were discovered in matched pairs. Almost all appear to have been deliberately deposited in graves or hoards, and their precise dating remains uncertain. Based on decorative styles, they likely date between the 5th and 2nd centuries BC and show no clear association with Roman material culture. These objects take the form of small, shallow bronze bowls, sized to fit comfortably within the palm of an adult hand. In nearly every pair, one spoon features a small off-center perforation, while the other is marked with an incised cross. These features led early archaeologists to propose a divinatory function, possibly involving the pouring of liquid into the perforated spoon so that it passed through the hole and collected in the second spoon below. Closer examination, however, has cast doubt on this interpretation. The bowls are too shallow to hold significant quantities of liquid, and experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the perforations are too small to allow water to flow freely. This does not entirely rule out ritual use. Other liquids, powders, or granulated substances may have been involved, but it does weaken earlier assumptions. Even so, these spoons remain important finds. They suggest a greater degree of shared ritual practice across Iron Age Britain than is evident from sanctuary architecture alone. Yet, as with so many other cases, there is no direct evidence linking them specifically to the Druids. Notably absent are the ritual items described by classical authors, such as the golden sickle or the so-called serpent eggs mentioned by Pliny the Elder. The closest material parallel to these literary descriptions comes from a single burial excavated at Stanway, near Colchester, dating to around AD 50. This grave, part of a cemetery associated with an early Roman period elite community, contained an assemblage of instruments closely resembling Greco-Roman surgical tools. What has attracted particular scholarly interest, however, is the inclusion of a unique set of metal rods, which archaeologists have suggested may have been used for divination. Alongside these items were a richly fastened cloak, an intact board game, and a tea strainer containing residues of artemisia, a plant known for its medicinal and ritual properties. Because of this combination of medical, divinatory, and elite status items, the burial has become known among archaeologists as the doctor's grave. To the wider public, however, the individual is often referred to as the Druid of Colchester. Was this person truly a Druid? The answer remains uncertain. Ancient authors consistently attributed knowledge of herbal medicine and divination to the Druids, and both are clearly represented in this burial. At the same time, there is substantial overlap between Iron Age magical practice and early medical traditions, particularly under Roman influence. Moreover, outside of the literary tradition, there is no clear evidence that this individual belonged to a formally organized priesthood. Much of the equipment found in the grave closely parallels known Roman medical kits, suggesting that the person may have functioned as a physician, a religious specialist, or a figure who combined both roles. In addition to the spoons, ceremonial headgear, and divinatory implements, there is one final object to consider, one that has become perhaps the most frequently cited material association with the Druids. This is the fragmentary remains of a large bronze tablet discovered in the late 19th century in eastern France, an artifact that would go on to reshape modern understanding of Iron Age ritual knowledge.